Hello.
You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to The Beautiful Idea. We're excited to bring you a jam-packed show today, and we have some amazing content planned. So be sure to subscribe to the show and follow us on Mastodon and Blue Sky. On today's episode, we'll first speak with an organizer for the recent Florida Abolitionist gathering, as well as a participant in the Imaginary Crimes Tour, which is already underway. It's about how people are fighting back against state repression against the Stop Cop City movement. We'll also hear about a call for events and gatherings on May Day, and then we hit the nerd overdrive button and unpack Trump's escalating trade war and the tariffs. But first, let's get to the news. We are now over 2 months into the second Trump administration, and already the regime has created a constitutional crisis and begun to defy some court orders, openly calling for judges to be impeached and issuing executive orders against law firms, while Trump moves to enrich himself and his cohorts, even performing a grotesque infomercial on the White House lawn for Tesla. This has also been coupled with sweeping ramp-ups for mass deportations, slashing social safety net programs, reorganizing cultural and educational institutions across the country, firing swaths of federal workers, and attacking labor unions and collective bargaining rights. Vicky Osterweil made some important observations recently, writing, "If we look at the current state of the fascist coup in the US, it is clear that they are making significant material progress while simultaneously losing more and more political and popular ground. The tariffs are a particularly extreme example of this contradiction. Trump has successfully claimed economic power over the entire globe exclusively to his person, let Congress, the people, his allies, even his cabinet be damned. But stock markets are in free fall. He's hemorrhaging support from the capitalist class, and even his own people have started beefing against him. But this contradiction has been visible in almost all of his moves. As he successfully wields powers constitutionally and legally unavailable to the executives, but all the while popular discontent, protests, and fury build at a rapid pace. This contradiction will only lead to accelerating confrontations until it is resolved. They really only had this two-pronged strategy: control the media and purge the government while robbing the till as fast as possible. But they attacked everyone at once, as though they had much broader control of the situation. The splits maximize popular resistance while actively demoralizing their base and their street forces. In Congress, Republicans pushed forward on their proposed budget package, which would mean drastic tax cuts for billionaires and corporations, $1 trillion for the Pentagon and for war, $45 billion to expand ICE detention prisons, while also cutting much-needed medical and food programs and throwing basic social safety nets like Social Security into chaos. Meanwhile, the economy stands on the verge of a possible recession as uncertainty in the markets grow and Trump continues to push through with tariffs, escalating a growing trade war with China. How this will play out for poor and working class people in the US remains to be seen, so be sure to listen later in the episode for more discussion of where this is all heading and the dystopian project underlying this push. And as a recession lies on the horizon, the Trump administration continues to push for increased repression and authoritarian attacks on growing segments of society. Multiple international students living inside the US legally have been abducted from their homes and disappeared, as the state has moved to revoke the visas of international students. Even more horrifically, the Trump administration has invoked the Alien Enemies Act of the late 1700s as justification for sending hundreds of Venezuelan migrants to a supermax anti-terrorist prison in El Salvador, in exchange for several $1 million from the far-right dictator of that country. Those sent to the prison, which is known for human rights abuses, will be used as slave labor. Recent investigations have found that the vast majority of those sent have no criminal records, including a man whose only evidence of his membership in a gang turned out to be a tattoo that celebrated literally autism awareness. Another person sent to the El Salvadorian prison, Kilmar Garcia, A union member living in Maryland that even the Trump administration admits was deported due to an error has sparked widespread anger, protests, and calls for his release. As It's Going Down reported in its column In Contempt, protest demonstrations in solidarity with Muhammad Khalil and others targeted by the Trump administration are spreading. Labor unions, which several targeted students belong to, have launched campaigns and organized rallies in solidarity. Trump Tower in New York was flooded by demonstrators with Jewish Voice for Peace, who shut down the lobby of the building, demanded freedom for Khalil, and denouncing fascist attacks on Palestinian solidarity activists. Protests in solidarity with targeted students have been organized across the country, mobilizing thousands in rallies and marches on campuses and in city centers. Students have organized walkouts on campus, and at Columbia University in New York, Jewish students carried out a lockdown and rallied to demand freedom for Khalil. Demonstrations and protests continue across the U.S. against ICE as well. Students have organized walkouts against attacks on migrants. Communities are banding together to denounce ICE raids, and rallies call for the closure of ICE prisons and to denounce collaboration with law enforcement. In Tacoma, Washington, hundreds turned out to demonstrate against ICE and to call for the release of several union organizers picked up and attacked by ICE. The Tacoma branch of the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, reported, "Today we attended the rally at the Northwest Detention Center right here in Tacoma to support all immigrants detained at the immigrant detention prison. The labor movement showed up in force. Multiple labor unions, community members, and organizations demanded the release of several immigrant union members and leaders, including a member of SEIU Local 925 and union leader Alfredo Lelo Juarez. We know that these attacks against immigrants and undocumented communities, as well as labor unions by the capitalist class, have been happening for decades, even centuries at this point. They are systematic and structural and part of the root causes: capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. We will continue the fight." Most recently in New York, a mother and her 3 children who were taken into custody by ICE agents as part of a sweep in the tiny hometown of Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, have been released following days of protests and outcry from community figures and advocates. Over the weekend, about 1,000 protesters marched outside of Homan's home in the small New York village, demanding their release. Resistance continues to bubble across the social terrain, with literally millions of people across the U.S. taking part in mass demonstrations over the past month against both Elon Musk and the Trump regime. One of the largest expressions of popular outrage at Elon Musk and the Trump administration has been the explosion of the Tesla takedown movement, which has held demonstrations and rallies outside of Tesla showrooms across the country since Trump came to power. On March 29th, thousands of people rallied outside of Tesla showrooms across the U.S. in a day of action. As It's Going Down reported, over the past 2 months, Tesla stock has tanked, costing Elon Musk billions of dollars. Trade-ins of Tesla vehicles have skyrocketed meanwhile, and boycotts in places like Germany, where Musk came out in support of the neo-fascist AfD party, has led to a massive decline in sales. Despite politicians and influencers rushing to encourage the MAGA faithful to buy Tesla vehicles, as Business Insider reported, quote, "Tesla has lost so much in value in such a short period of time that JP Morgan analysts said that they couldn't think of another example comparable to any moment in automotive history." Trump officials have also pushed to demonize a growing chorus of sabotage, graffiti, and property destruction against Tesla vehicles, labeling it domestic terrorism while predictably echoing far-right conspiracies that such acts are being funded, as Trump even floated the idea that anti-Tesla protesters would be sent to prisons in El Salvador, and Musk has claimed that the Trump administration would, quote, "go after vocal critics of his company." Increased authoritarian rhetoric from Trump, Musk, and pundits on Fox News has galvanized a small section of the far-right, neo-Nazis, and Republican groups to mobilize in public support of Musk and his increasingly unpopular attacks on working-class Americans in an attempt to intimidate anti-Musk protesters. Already in Florida, a Trump supporter was arrested last week after driving his car onto a sidewalk in an apparent attempt to injure anti-Tesla protesters. And in Berkeley, California, a far-right influencer clashed with demonstrators after he pulled a weapon on the crowd. Despite the far-right coming out in support of Musk, the number of anti-Tesla demonstrations only continues to increase, with protests continuing to take place at hundreds of locations on March 29th. Calls for counter-protests by Trump supporters, neo-Nazis, and Proud Boys also failed to stop or intimidate anti-Tesla demonstrators, and generally far-right rally-goers were vastly outnumbered when counter-protests did take place. More anti-Tesla demonstrations are planned in the coming weeks as Tesla stock continues to tank. Meanwhile, acts of targeted vandalism against Tesla show no signs of slowing down, as Tesla cars in various cities have been set aflame, and damages are reported in a growing number of incidents. The state is also ramping up calls to charge those arrested for vandalism with domestic terrorism. On April 5th, various progressive organizations aligned largely with the Democratic Party held massive hands-off demonstrations in over 1,000 cities and towns across the U.S., mobilizing upwards of millions of people. While the protests are certainly a temperature check that Trump's policies are largely unpopular, as many have pointed out, the attempt to herd us back into the Democratic Party is a dead end. As the anarchist author Peter Gelderloos wrote, "It is insanely delusional to believe that the Democratic Party is capable of changing in a meaningful way. It is insanely delusional to trust them. They are guilty of genocide, mass murder, mass incarceration, impoverishment, bloody wars, and oppressive politics. The system they uphold, the system they promise can be reformed if we trust them one more time, has condemned this generation and the next one to a future of unimaginable suffering, danger, and poverty." Occupations of campus buildings to demand divestment from Israel took place in Maine and at Columbia University in New York, where students occupied a building to protest the expulsion of pro-Palestinian students. At UCLA, hundreds of students rallied and took over a building and dropped banners during a demonstration against the UC Board of Regents. In anti-fascist news, Proud Boys were confronted in the Pacific Northwest, and neo-Nazis of Patriot Front were chased away by anti-Trump protesters in Rhode Island when they tried to hold a counter-rally. Demonstrations against MAGA fascists with Turning Point USA continue across the country, with communities holding counter-demonstrations in Memphis, Tennessee against Kyle Rittenhouse and anti-trans grifter Riley Gaines in various cities. In Davis, California, over 30 mass demonstrators confronted and tore down a Turning Point USA booth at UC Davis. In the Bay Area, residents organized a protest following a far-right rally on a freeway overpass. In Colorado Springs, demonstrators rallied against a speaking event featuring MAGA fascist Steve Bannon. Also in Colorado, hundreds rallied in protest against white supremacist Jared Taylor, who was invited to speak on a local campus by a Turning Point USA activist. Finally, in Green Bay, Wisconsin, hundreds rallied against an appearance by Elon Musk. In repression news in California, several protesters who occupied a building at Stanford in solidarity with Palestine last year have now been charged with felonies. There's also an update on political prisoner Casey Goonan, which you can read linked in our show notes. Sam Beard, an activist in the movement to stop Cop City and a host to the Party Girls podcast and also a spokesperson for the Defense Fund for Luigi Mangione, issued a statement that they were visited by two FBI agents who were part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, or JTTF, hours before Beard appeared on News Nation speaking about the ongoing case of Luigi Mangione, who was accused of assassinating the CEO of United Healthcare. In a statement posted to social media, Beard stated, "The task force targeted me not for anything I've done, but for what I've said." And now for some shoutouts and updates. Dugout Podcast, which is now part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Network, has been putting out a stream of amazing shows and content, so be sure to check them out. There's a new podcast, Outlaw, which looks at state repression of social movements, so don't miss it. A new media and publishing project, Heatwave, has been launched, so check out a link for it in our show notes. The long-running anarchist media project Submedia is getting ready to release their new video project, Enter Rebellion, so check out the trailer linked in our show notes. CrimeThink has published a call for events on May Day, so tune in later in this episode to hear an audio version of it. Also be sure to check out CAW, or Collective of Anarchist Writers, a worker-run collaborative which is producing high-quality writing and content featuring anarchist analysis and opinion. And finally, as stated previously, the Imaginary Crimes Tour is hitting the road, speaking with communities across the U.S. about the fight against repression of Stop Cop City activists and beyond. Tune in later on this show to hear an interview about the tour and check out a link in our show notes for a list of tour stops happening near you. And finally, for some upcoming events. On May 1st is May Day, with events and demonstrations happening all over the globe. On May 15th through the 21st is the Constellation Anarchist Festival in Montreal, Quebec. On May 17th through the 18th is the Los Angeles Book Fair in Los Angeles, California. On May 17th is the DMV Anarchist Book Fair in Washington, D.C., followed by the Heart of the Valley Anti-Capitalist Book Fair in Corvallis, Oregon on May 23rd through the 25th. And finally, looking ahead, on June 7th is the Inland Empire Anarchist Book Fair in the Inland Empire of California. That's going to do it for us. Enjoy the interviews coming up, and we will see you soon.
May Day means resistance. A call to action on May 1st. This May Day, gather in defiance of tyranny and oppression, gather to create communities based in solidarity and mutual aid, gather with everyone who wants a better life, gather to honor those who fought before us, gather to show that another world is possible. As May Day 2025 approaches, we face an increasingly grim situation. Donald Trump and his lackeys are restructuring the state, redirecting even more resources towards repression and filling their pockets along the way. They are already deporting students on the basis of their political views, and they've made it clear that they intend to escalate to deporting U.S. citizens as well. All the while, the ecological damage, climate disasters, wars, and genocides that were already in progress are only intensifying. While some are lying low, hoping that the tide will turn, that is a terrible mistake. How far this nightmare can go will be determined by what people do now to build movements of resistance. The more time passes, the firmer Trump's grip on the institutions will be, and the better positioned he will be to expand and intensify repression. Even if Trump's ill-thought-out policies alone suffice to turn the majority of the population against him, that will not answer the question of how to push him out of power. He has already shown that he will not leave office willingly. It also will not ensure that what comes after will be any better. Remember, we ended up in this situation because of the catastrophic reign of the Biden administration. There's no way around it. We have to build powerful grassroots movements through which to defend each other and popularize a radical analysis of what we're up against. May Day offers a perfect occasion for this. For nearly a century and a half, anarchists and other revolutionaries have observed it as a day of celebration and resistance. Tapping into the long-standing tradition offers many reference points for what we can do right now. Wherever you are, you can do something for May Day. Better yet, organize a week of events, including education, mutual aid, arts, and entertainment, and a march or demonstration. We've prepared a poster design to support your organizing and promoting events in your community. You can find this at crimethink.com. Most of the suggestions that follow here are things you can do with 24 people. Organizing doesn't have to involve massive numbers to be worthwhile. Even in movements that do involve massive numbers, the best way to ensure that they will be resilient and effective is to make sure that people are in the habit of talking, making decisions, and taking action in small groups so as to maximize the agency of the participants. In Washington, D.C., an ad hoc group is calling for an occupation of the National Mall. Quote, "Our strategy is to establish a 24/7 legal, nonviolent demonstration on the National Mall, calling on Congress to take the only logical step in this crisis, impeach and remove Donald Trump." Elsewhere around the country, from Seattle and Eugene to Minneapolis, long-standing groups are also planning events. People in Auburn and Washington are planning a whole day of activities the preceding weekend just to get things started. But don't leave everything to them. If anything really exciting is going to happen, it's up to you. Outreach. Spring is in the air. It's a good time to make new connections. Even if you are already organizing in a tight-knit community of anarchists, this is a chance to reach out to people you don't know yet. Invite them to events, talk to them about their concerns, propose ideas for what you could do together. Even if you are completely isolated and cannot organize events with other humans, you can order stickers from Municipal Adhesives, and, sure, from us as well. Us, in this situation, being Crime Thing. And bring the bus stops and electrical boxes of your neighborhood to life. Pocket a paint marker and add ice to every stop sign in your county. Cut a stencil design to the bottom of a thick paper shopping bag and walk around your neighborhood with a can of spray paint in the bag, leaving a little trail of messages everywhere you go. If you are not a gifted artist, Municipal Adhesives mails out stencils too. Download and print posters, make wheat paste or obtain wallpaper paste, and go out putting up posters. You could do all of these things even if you're the only sentient life form within 100 miles. On the other hand, if you're not the only sentient life form within 100 miles, you could also print or order some zines and set up a literature table at a punk show, a campus, a farmer's market, or failing all else at the bus stop where you put up your first sticker. Education. For May Day, you could organize a reading group around a text engaging with the history of May Day. You could host a presentation on anarchism or the history of resistance in your local community. You could call for a discussion connecting one of those themes to the various attacks that the Trump administration is currently carrying out, with an eye to strategizing a response. You could also announce a gathering in a public location at which people read aloud the final statements of the Haymarket Martyrs, the ones whose sacrifice for the labor movement gave rise to May Day as we know it today. Likewise, you could read one of the speeches of lifelong anarchist organizer Lucy Parsons, whose husband was among the murdered. As the Trump administration smashes and loots the infrastructure of state-sponsored education, it's important to be building up our own educational models. Organizing. You could call for an assembly, bringing together different people affected by or working on an issue such as ICE deportations or environmental damage, at which to coordinate resistance. Even if the administration has not targeted your community yet, you should do this now in order to be prepared. For example, you could come up with a plan and get all the resources in place to respond as soon as they take a given action. Arts and entertainment. The May Day Parade is a time-honored tradition, especially in places like Minneapolis. If there's already something like that happening near you, great. All you have to do is organize a contingent for it. But if there's not a May Day parade in your area, that is also great. It means you can organize one according to your own preferences. Don't neglect to prepare banners, giant puppets, or other artistic elements. In 2017, anarchists in Portland made giant spiders for their May Day parade. For later in the evening or over the weekend, you could book a benefit show featuring local bands. For extra credit, you could host a show in a subversive location, such as under an overpass or in an abandoned warehouse. End the night with a dance party. Mutual aid. For the occasion, you could host a really free market, a potluck, or a workday at a community garden or social center. Taking the offensive. All of this will be of little use if we can't also go on the attack. Limiting ourselves to attempting to manage the details of our survival in a non-hierarchical way, while the state inflicts brutal violence on more and more people, means accepting defeat in advance. We should respond to their offenses, but it is crucial that we pick the time and place of our own. Thus far, one solid example of this is the Tesla protests, which have opened up a new front of conflict, distracting the attention of Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and laying bare their vulnerabilities. But there are many other ways to take the fight to the oppressors. Recall the ICE occupations of 2018. Identify a target, and call for a protest or some other form of action there. If there is no obvious target available, you can still organize a public demonstration for the purposes of getting people used to moving together and engaging in collective expression, however symbolic. A smaller group of people preserving the element of surprise could also take action, sending up a signal flare to let others know that they are not alone in their rage. Remember, at any demonstration that could be subject to repression, leave your phone at home and dress to preserve your anonymity. You can find more resources about taking action at crimethink.com.
We're joined with an organizer from the Florida Abolitionist Gathering, which was a weekend of workshops, film, food, ritual, and protest in Florida from February 28th to March 2nd. Welcome to the podcast, and would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me. I am an organizer from the Florida Abolitionist Gathering. Just repeating your intro sounds good to me.
So what we kind of briefly talked about what it was, but what was sort of the impetus? Like, why did you feel it was important to put on something like this at this moment?
Well, I think repression and fascist ideology is expanding rapidly before our eyes, especially in the context of Florida. And as a person that focuses a lot of their time on anti-carceral abolitionist organizing, having a gathering that both inspires that for people and also brings people together that are doing that so we can share skills and grow together felt like an important thing to do right now.
Awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of people are familiar, obviously, with the national context, but in Florida specifically, does it feel important to sort of fight where you stand, even with increasing, conservative and reactionary sentiment in the area that you're at?
Yeah, always. I don't know that that's any different in the present moment than it has been for me for many years. I think the South is a important place for radical ideas and dreams to be, and it exists, and it's often not seen by the rest of the country, but there's lots of folks in the South all over doing really rad stuff, and just having that be acknowledged and highlighted through a weekend of anarchist abolitionists discussion seemed like an important thing, but it's always been important, not just now.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think on that note, where do you see like the importance of like inside-outside organizing in general, and why is it so key to remember people that are locked up and fight alongside them or whatever?
I mean, that's like the key to everything, I think. Like the people that are directly experiencing that sort of isolation and being encaged and just like not being connected to people on the outside is central to I'm constantly focusing on how to make sure those voices are connected to the outside struggle. We have endless resources outside in the free world to expand and like broaden our minds, and those resources are so limited and constantly being removed from inside prisons. So having that connection to people directly is an important thing, but also like it's mutual, like we're in solidarity with them and they're in solidarity with us, and it's a mutual relationship where we expand together is what it feels like.
It's important to note that a lot of these struggles are already happening and ongoing, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk about like some of the existing groups, both inside and outside, that you sort of connected with to help make this weekend possible.
Yeah, in Gainesville, there's a couple of groups. There's the Florida Prisoner Solidarity Network that used to be a Gainesville IWOC chapter from, like a incarcerated workers organizing committee. They disaffiliated a couple of years ago and now just focus on inside-outside organizing with folks across Florida. And then there's Gainesville Books to Prisoners as well here in this area of Florida. And then there's a group from South Florida that came called CHIP, the Community Hotline for Incarcerated People. They formed out of COVID, doing a hotline at the Broward County Jail, and kind of have expanded since then. And one of the presentations that they did was on how to start a jail hotline. Another one was on this album that they've created with people that have been incarcerated, and did recordings over like prison phone lines and jail phone lines. Is pretty cool. There's this other group called Root Legal that came. This is just like Florida folks that are coming to mind, but Root Legal out of Miami is trying to like get involved in the criminal legal process by intervening and representing victims who are being, forced to kind of work with the state to prosecute. So trying to like intervene in that legal process at that point. So, because it's pretty coercive if you don't want to be involved in that. That's what comes to mind, at least right now.
Yeah, I think a lot of people often get kind of overwhelmed by the idea of reinventing the wheel, and then even highlighting how there's groups in other places already doing the stuff that you can link up with might be helpful for some listening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm also noticing like at this weekend there was a lot of space for, grief and ritual, and that's something that I haven't necessarily seen at like a lot of, conferences and meetups, and I'm wondering if you would like to talk about like where the role of ritual for you comes in, or like why that was seen as important in these moments.
Yeah, me and like some of the other organizers was really important. We've, like many other people, have lost too many comrades, and it kind of feels important to acknowledge those losses as we move forward and build together. Those folks come to mind every day for me, and they're important to everything that I do. And so having that be a collective thing that we did with people so we could learn more people, or just kind of hold space with each other, seemed really important to any revolutionary politic. And it was a really beautiful gathering where we invited people to bring things for an altar that we collectively built, and then everybody offered names of people that they've lost or insights, or it's just it was important for us to do that at the beginning, so that we held grief had a moment with us the whole weekend, but there was a part of it, and then the altar was there the whole weekend too, that people could spend time with or interact with however they felt best.
Awesome. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, it's kind of seems like a simple thing to do in certain situations, but I feel like there's a lot of, generative stuff that can come out of really thinking that and holding space for that.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any other moments that you would want to highlight from the weekend that we haven't touched on yet?
I mean, it was a really full weekend. I think in retrospect of as a person that was involved in organizing it, we maybe overpacked it. There's just so much to do and so much to learn, and you don't have to go to everything, but you want to go to everything kind of vibe. We had some film screenings at the end of the night, and it was just kind of every minute there was a thing that could happen, which was good and productive and generative, but also maybe didn't allow for enough space for people to kind of build their own. I think one of my favorite parts was having it be a space that felt calm and welcoming, which I've gone to another number of other gatherings and it doesn't feel like that, where like the space feels like kind of cold and or like too spread out maybe, or like people getting into conflict and fights, which just like is inevitable. But that we were lucky that wasn't what the focus was this weekend.
Yeah, kind of on that line a little bit. Is there anything that you would do differently? And this can also be like a joke answer, like something funny could have happened. But yeah, I think this is like maybe important to think about other people putting on events, if you have any like lessons that you learned from putting this on.
I think that the first thing that comes to mind is what I just mentioned, was just like maybe doing too much. Yeah. We had a debrief, like a collective debrief at the end on the Sunday night of the gathering, to be specific, try to get feedback about the gathering. And kind of like also the thought of that was to hold space for if something did happen that needed to be processed during the weekend. I think that maybe that should be at every gathering, honestly. I don't think I've ever been to one that has had a debrief time like allotted already. But I think it was also like really tight evening schedule stuff. So maybe having like more loose end stuff at the end of the days felt more important. I think that, I don't know, there's just like so much good and so much like also growth that can always happen. I think it was a really great weekend, and there's definitely points that I would like address differently if I am ever involved in doing one like this again. But it was, I don't know, it was better than other ones I've been to, at least, and that feels good to walk away with, you know?
Yeah, totally. I guess, yeah, also, so the Florida Abolitionist Gathering, the name spells out a particular word, and I'm wondering if you want to talk about, like, the kind of unabashed queerness of the event and, like, your thinking around that, or, like, the impact of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's an importance to specifically inviting what you want to see, and we wanted to see fags and faggotry and queers and trans people in the space. We are those people, you know, and like, I want to have that intersection be named all the time, especially in like abolitionist organizing, because it is such a big intersection that's constantly there. Like, the people that I work with inside know that queers are the people showing up for them. And it's like a conversation that's not taboo and it needs to be discussed. But also, like, that's who's being targeted by, you know, the current climate of the political world right now, I guess. Prisoners and queer people. The queers show out, you know? Our liberations are all intertied.
Yeah. It feels particularly important in this sort of backswing of reactionary normality or whatever. Yeah, let's see. Trying to think. Yeah, there was also, you know, I think in the contemporary, a lot of people are familiar with, like, you know, fundraising efforts and pen pal efforts. I'm wondering if there's any other forms of solidarity with prisoners that, you know, sort of were highlighted during this event, or that, like, you would want to highlight at this moment.
Yeah, we ended each night with like some sort of fundraiser, like an event. Like, Friday night was a benefit show, Saturday night was a rave, Sunday night was like a karaoke sort of thing, just like a way to like have some sort of like fun, joyous, collective thing, but also use it as a way to like raise money for mutual aid. So each benefit was like, you know, Florida Prisoner Solidarity, the local group, or Books to Prisoners, or the mutual aid efforts in Sudan and Gaza. And that was important because you have all of these people that care about stuff like that coming to one space. And through that, we were able to raise lots of money for all those groups. In northern Gaza, we were able to help fund a water well that is now helping get like drinking water to like 300 families. So it wasn't just a weekend of talk, you know, which felt great.
I'm also curious if you have something to say about the importance of, like, giving a space for incarcerated voices or recently incarcerated voices, and, like, how that played out.
Yeah, there was a session that I was involved in that had one of Florida Prisoner Solidarity's inside members who was newly released. He got out February 3rd after doing nearly 20 years. And so we've known him since the 2016 national strikes. And this was our like first time meeting him in person. And that was so important, and it felt really great. And it's so rare. Like, people that we organize with that are doing prison time here in Florida, them getting out is rare. it's not, people here are doing life without parole oftentimes, like at least the folks that are like involved in a lot of the inside organizing, because why not risk it all at that point,
Yeah.
So we had a session Saturday, and he came and spoke in front of everybody about like what the political isolation of being inside feels like, and how that, like, what that connection is to organizing with people on the outside. And it was just a very moving conversation because, well, one, while we were in it, a friend of ours came a little late, and they like were able to like meet for the first time in front of all of these people. It's like a thing to see. And also there was like a point where I asked him what he thinks the outside organizing efforts how they should evolve to like combat the like increasing repression of how to like share information, and like how prisons are censoring things more, or like, what tactics need to evolve. And he responded, but he also was like, well, I'm on the outside now, so this is how we need to evolve. Which is just like, it's just small things like that are just really impactful and meaningful. But yeah, no, there was lots of folks that have been incarcerated that we had come that weekend, like, more than usual at least. And it was really a beautiful piece of the whole weekend, because it's just like so many people we got to meet for the first time.
Okay, that kind of does it for my list of questions that I had. Do you have anything else you want to add? Is there ways that people can keep up with your organizing efforts or activities or resources you want to plug right now?
Well, we bought too many shirts, so people should contact us to like buy these shirts off of us. That would be great.
Awesome.
The Instagram at Fagathering. Yeah, there's not necessarily a known like idea of doing it again. I don't see why not, but organizing an event is not just an easy thing that takes a little bit of your life. It took a long time, but we would love to see regional gatherings happen, and like sharing the load kind of vibe of this in the South. GAG, we welcome Georgia Abolitionists to do GAG next. Lag, there's just so much potential,
Yeah.
So yeah, but like people should definitely connect and reach out, and there's no time to begin your engagement in the movement besides now.
We'll close out this conversation with two recordings clipped from longer conversations that were played at Florida Abolitionist Gathering from incarcerated organizers. The first one being from Heru, who was a longtime incarcerated organizer, kind of talking about the limits of reform, his radicalization, and then the second being from a trans woman who, like all trans women incarcerated in Florida, is incarcerated in a men's prison, and kind of just talking about her experience of incarceration being alienating and how political work has sort of helped break through that. And you can write to these people by using the addresses provided in the show notes, the podcast description. Without further ado, here's Heru.
They want to, like politicians, they want to put better politicians in office, right? And I'm like, yeah, y'all got the numbers to do that, but what is that really going to change? They want me to explain to them, and I was like, yeah, I'll participate because there's a reform, and we could use reform as small victories for bigger more room to fight, more fighting room. But if you're not going against the system, these people that you're going to put in office, they're not going to get in office unless they are down with the system. And it doesn't matter who's in office. If the economic substructure is still capitalist, you're not getting no change. It don't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat or even an independent. There's no way you can tell me you live in the richest country in the world and you work and you can't pay your bills and feed your children at the same time. Do other things. Basic needs are not being met by the people who are doing the biggest work. The laborers are not getting their fair share for their labor, and their children have to go out in the streets and hustle and do that and then come to jail. And when they come to jail, now these parents gotta support their children from the streets, and they basically supporting DOC because all the money they send into their children or their loved ones in prisons is going to DOC. You got the canteen, which is now, I think Trinity or one of them, is paying DOC $1 plus a day per prisoner. For every prisoner, DOC get $1 a day. If you got 100,000 prisoners, that's $100,000 a day. And the profits of that is being used to buy gas to spray you, pepper spray to spray you. handcuffs to cuff you up, bullets to shoot you, guns to shoot you. I mean, what radicalized me was the reality, for one. As a black man, I had to learn black history. So when I started learning black history, it was like, this what brought me to studying the Panthers and all of that. It's just going down the line in black history, coming down to here. I started off learning about Africa, and when I got to here, slavery, of course, can't learn black history without slavery. And then I got into the political scene, the labor movements and all of that. That's what really politicized me, when I really got to see that nothing has changed. You know what I mean? We just in a new time and new people, and we just going along with the same issues. You know what I mean? The same issues that they were fighting for back in the days, we're still fighting for them.
And here is the clip with Rain.
For me, a big part of the insidiousness of being in here is that it separates you from the world. It creates the illusion that you are irrevocably separated from the world. And efforts of organizations like ours, like yours, give us an opportunity to be free of that mentality. We don't feel so disconnected so long as we're engaging in something that can make a real difference.
Yeah.
In my experience.
You're saying that like practicing a politic, or like living to your ideals is what's saving you a little bit from that isolation.
Absolutely. There's nothing worse than feeling like you have no meaning. Nothing that you're doing makes a difference anymore, that you're no longer a participant in the world. And when you have an opportunity to put your writing out there, or even better, your voice out there, and share something of yourself with the world, and, the world responds, you feel like you're part of it again. That's probably a gross oversimplification, but I know for me, that speech that I told you about that I did, knowing that people out there were able to hear my speech and respond to it, that made a difference for me. That made me feel like my voice, mattered outside of the context of prison. I know that whenever I have an opportunity to do any writing or inside organizing, or, even just when something's going on and I know I can help people do something like complete their grievances so that they can participate in ongoing litigation, such as with the recent transgender issues, that also makes me feel like I'm making a difference.
Hi, thanks for joining The Beautiful Idea to talk about the upcoming Imaginary Crimes Tour. Could you introduce yourself to listeners really quick?
Hi, my name is Ruth in this conversation, and I am one of the organizers for the Stop Cop City Imaginary Crimes Tour.
Amazing. And we'll get right into what the Imaginary Crimes Tour is in just a second. But for context, 61 people are facing RICO trials in Atlanta for alleged involvement in resistance to the construction of Cop City, which, as many of our listeners probably already know, is a massive militarized police training compound slated to be built over forest land in southeast Atlanta, Georgia. To kick us off, can you let us know can you explain what is RICO?
Yeah, great question. I think plenty of people have maybe an idea of what RICO is based on like television or the movies. Oftentimes it's connected with the idea of organized crime, or specifically the mafia. The actual definition is the racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization charge. Allegedly, this criminal charge was created because prosecutors had petitioned for the creation of this law on the federal level, because they had insisted that these corrupt organizations were just too sophisticated in their existence to simply charge them with the host of criminal charges that already exist, and that they needed more power to be able to connect seemingly unconnected individuals to a central organization, a corrupt organization. And more or less that was where RICO has been birthed out of, which unsurprisingly has then been used and abused over what has now been roughly 55 years since its inception. There's the federal statutes. There's also many state statutes, as well as the ability to bring civil RICO charges against individuals. Also, unsurprisingly, the Georgia standard for RICO, which is what the folks in this struggle are being charged with, is more broad than the federal statute. And it allows for greater leniency in terms of connecting individuals to a corrupt organization. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind as it relates to RICO is that there has to be two overt acts that connect you or that connect your activity to the criminal organization. These overt acts do not necessarily have to be inherently illegal, but they are supporting the criminal organization in question. And I'm sure plenty of your listeners have maybe decided to read the criminal indictment that was dropped in September of 2023, the very beginning. It's kind of on the line between August and September. And some of the things that people were alleged to have done that connect them to this criminal organization include buying glue, or writing ACAB, or things that are kind of like silly like that, and or receiving reimbursements for an organization to buy art supplies. But anyone that has been paying attention to this fight knows that the Deputy Attorney General, John Fowler, has a wild imagination that includes saying things that, well, we know that they said that they were reimbursed for art supplies, but they clearly were making bombs. And this has been said in open court with no evidence or follow-up, just he really believes it deep down in his heart. And that seemingly is enough. And, for many of us, we've been shocked and horrified and slightly amused by all the things that we've seen go before us. But something that's also interesting to me is that while this is being charged to the AG's office, Fulton County is one of the most prominent counties in the entire United States for bringing RICO charges against individuals. Two very famous and impactful RICO cases that have been going on or were going on include the YSL trial, they include Young Thug, and then also actually Donald Trump as it relates to their abuse of the electors in the 2020 election. And while those are two very prominent cases, RICO is often used to just cast an extremely wide net to bring in entire communities and criminalize any connections, despite the fact if someone supposedly knows that they're attached to a criminal organization or what their specific role is. It doesn't really matter to these prosecutors so long as they're putting more and more people in some of the most deadliest prisons in the United States and to continue to increase control. So it's not surprising that the RICO statute has been used against this movement and how vibrant it's been, but its specific application, especially when you look at the indictment and how detail-oriented and how much it just resembles an undergraduate's essay on the history of anarchy specifically, that is a little shocking.
It sounds sort of like ChatGPT wrote it.
Oh, absolutely. Another reason why I'm not surprised that they've applied the RICO charges is because something that I'm personally inspired by the Stop Cop City movement in general, is that it's an incredibly strong movement. It's inspired folks, not even locally, but also globally to an extent, to see the fact how hard that people are fighting back and the diversity of tactics that have been used to fight back against this militarization of the police. But the fact that with the diversity of tactics that have been employed, not one organization within all this coalition building has been willing to throw anyone else under the bus. And I think because the prosecutor in the state knows, specifically Attorney Chris Carr, knows that people will not be afraid and people understand that they have a common goal of stopping the construction of this cop city in the southeast Atlanta forest, in the Weelaunee forest, that they had to do whatever they could to try to cut off the more radical arm of the movement there in Atlanta. But as we've seen, especially considering that they've decided to include the Atlanta Solidarity Fund in this conspiracy, that the community has completely surrounded our people, that have surrounded these RICO defendants and have protected them and have fought back and have decided and have said that this is illegitimate and that it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. And that we believe that these trials, obviously, as they are so often, is punishment by prosecution and that they will not produce anything. But nonetheless, I guess now it's going on 2 years later, people's lives have been completely uprooted. People have lost their jobs. People have been deplatformed. People have lost access to bank accounts. People have lost grants and awards that they've gotten from the government and from other institutions because of their connection and the charges that have resulted from this prosecution. And we are fighting back because we know that while the state is constantly in a battle for legitimacy, that we know that we stand on a higher moral ground.
What is the Imaginary Crimes Tour, and why did you decide to call it that?
Yeah, so the Imaginary Crimes Tour is a national speaking tour to talk about the RICO charges and the DT charges and other major charges that participants or movement participants in the Stop Cop City movement have been charged with, and to talk about the state of repression and also movement resiliency that we're currently in. We began planning this tour just to talk about the charges nearly a year ago, and now I think the time is ripe as ever to be engaging with folks across different movements who are also facing extreme repression, and to have an opportunity to connect and to reflect and to build stronger and deeper relationships. The idea of the Imaginary Crimes Tour is the idea that when we read the indictment, it's very obvious that the state of Georgia is trying to criminalize essentially freedom of association and the idea that we can live in a more liberatory world and that we have the power to actually dictate how our communities should function. And if hundreds of thousands of people are rising up saying that they don't want a cop city, that we are able to imagine a better world that we want to live in. I think it's also funny to think about it on the flip side of the coin. Anyone that has listened in to any of the hearings or has maybe read the criminal indictment, I'm sure it brings to mind that one meme from Always Sunny where they're standing in front of the board with the red string, because that's essentially is the more you listen, it's just they can't believe what they're saying. They know that they can't believe what they're saying, but they just keep on spouting out more and more ideas, hoping that it makes
the state is Charlie. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I really want to see a meme of John Fowler's face on Charlie's body. Because it's the longer you sit around, you're like, this can't be real. These are not, despite the fact that they have one of the highest office in Georgia, these are not serious people. These are political actors. Chris Carr is trying to run for governor, and he wants to show that he's tough on crime and to be coded and read by Fox News as, oh, look, he's taking down land defenders and water protectors and the woke left and Antifa and whatever else at the expense of everyone else's lives, at the expense of the forest, at the expense of Tortiguita, expense of everyone else that's been connected to this fight. It's for their own political gains. These are not serious people, despite the fact that they are power hungry and abusive.
So this is sort of like a slap suit, right? Like a strategic lawsuit against public participation. I don't know if people have made that comparison before. And I think you've already said this, but the title is sort of calling to mind how this state likes to use imaginary associations of crimes framed as RICO as a means to break solidarity and momentum, specifically when movements are strong. And so anti-repression is a response that uses an alternative imagination to strengthen solidarity and resistance, I think is how it's framed in some of the promotional materials about this tour. And I think that's a really cool sort of duality there that people organizing this tour are trying to call to mind. So I think you've already spoken to the goals of the tour, but how can people support the Atlanta 61 if they would like to? And then I have a few more questions about where people can find more information and learn about tour stops near them.
Yeah, great question. So the easiest way to connect for the time being is to find us on Instagram. Our handle is SCC Imaginary Crimes Tour, where we'll be posting all of our updates. Our bio also has a link tree. The link tree actually has the individual fundraisers for the co-defendants who are asking for financial support. There eventually will be a larger co-defendant fund to support all of those folks who are going to trial, but that information is forthcoming. Obviously, if you're listening to this and one of your friends or someone who's a friend of a friend is a co-defendant, we always encourage people to ideally reach out to them. Oftentimes people need financial support, want helping with fundraisers, and also we would encourage you to come to one of our tour stops and to engage with people in person and to have conversations about what are the needs and what are exciting ways to continue to build this movement while we're in this rest period, while we're in this lull.
Great. Finally, is there anything else that you'd like to share with listeners before we log off?
Well, please check out our tour list. Please come to one of our stops. We would love to have you. I'm sure if you're listening to this podcast, you also dream and imagine of a better world. And what better time than now is to engage in these conversations and to do it in person.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on to give us this info.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Okay, we are back. We have a lot to talk about, of course. We're going to start by talking about the tariffs. This is being recorded after Trump has announced these sweeping tariffs. He held up that weird sort of looked like almost like a giant smartphone with all this stuff that included islands that only penguins live on, which a lot of liberals have gone to town on with witty signs and stuff like that. I think it's important for us to tease out sort of a couple things. How this will actually play out. What does this actually mean? What does this mean for us and working class people? How will this affect our lives? And how is this sort of exposing the tensions within ruling elite circles, different billionaires, and even people within Donald Trump's own camp? Elon Musk has sort of come out against this. Various billionaires that are associated with Trump have sort of, put out cautionary statements. There's been a lot of, fluctuation. The market is a bear market now, whatever that means. It's not doing well. There's an open question if we're going to see another recession sort of along the lines of what we saw in 2008. So we're going to try to tease all that out. So let's just start out by talking about this is not something that Trump kind of put out there as we're just going to use this as a negotiating tactic. He really believes this. He believes that this will lead to some sort of new Gilded Age. Let's talk about what is the project that he's putting out there, because I think it's also important for us to understand what it is, because there is some economic nationalist narrative of bringing jobs back to the U.S., having manufacturing here that, some people on the left would say well, that's part of what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So to understand what's going on here, I think we have to trace it back to kind of two intellectual tendencies, that one of the past and one of the present, that are kind of fusing together in this sort of vision. So the idea of an isolationist America returning back to a Gilded Age is an idea which emerged out of the paleoconservative movement sort of in the 1960s and 70s. A lot of those people like Pat Buchanan, ended up working for Richard Nixon and then later Reagan. And their basic idea was, America to them in their language was great in, the 1920s. It was really awesome. And the reason that is that we had crazy high trade tariffs. And so what that meant is that everybody had to produce everything here. And that meant the American economy was strong because we weren't dependent on anybody else. And there's a lot loaded into that claim. There's a lot of levels in which that claim is just factually wrong, but there's a lot loaded into that claim as far as things like racism and xenophobia and sort of narratives of cultural cleanliness and things like this that also come along with all of that. So there is this idea latent in the paleoconservative movement. It's not particularly well articulated, but this concept that if the United States can become an economy that is national again, right, that we make and produce and consume our own stuff, then we will somehow magically return back to this wonderful age of the 1920s or something. This is literally the vision they put forward. It's strange, but this is why they talk about the Gilded Age so much. It's sort of a proto-utopian moment in their narrative. And so Trump comes out of a certain East Coast kind of wealthy paleoconservative circle, which very deeply believes that kind of idea and has been isolationist for a very long time. The second element, though, and this is an idea Richard Seymour talks about, disaster nationalism, which I think I'm just getting into it, really, really good. But one of the things that he's talking about is you're seeing this revival of nationalism, but nationalism that's different than as it appeared during the age of imperialism. So the British imperial state, those nationalists, those advocates of the British Empire, were advocating a very different thing than most British nationalists from the British National Party are today. right? That the British National Party are isolationists, and they're talking about making an isolated and strong England, right? Just like Trump is an isolationist, right? And they're talking about making an isolated and strong America. It is a form of national strength politics that doesn't involve international expansion necessarily. It involves this kind of world of competition over international spheres of influence, but not necessarily the control of territories, right? Some of that is because what we've really seen in the last 40 years, right, 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union has really been kind of the end of what traditionally would have been considered a sustainable model of imperialism, right? That it still does exist. There's still remnants of this. But the idea that one invades a place, occupies that place, extracts everything out of that place, enslaves the population, that is a concept of statehood which has become less and less and less and less and less common since the British Empire collapsed, since the Iraq War went sideways for the United States, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine went sideways, right? We've really seen this kind of world in which states can't just project power wherever they want to without consequence anymore. And so when we look at those realities put together, what we see is this. And so it's a kind of national strength politics, which is deeply grounded in a notion of sort of American supremacy, this idea that America is like special and unique, and that if we just did everything for ourselves, then we would just like be super special and unique, right? Like that's the underlying ideological idea. Yeah, like they've tried to put a bunch of veneers of economics on top of it, which we should talk about. But those veneers of economics are veneers. The arguments that they're putting forward don't make any sense when put together. And so a lot of what is happening here is that there is an attempt to sell what is a deeply nationalist and racist ideological project as a sort of economic restructuring plan, right? And the part of the consequence of that is that the material consequences of what they're doing are almost secondary to the social consequences of what they'll generate in the future, right? And that's a really dangerous place for us to be.
Pull that out, because I mean, I think the next question is like, what does this actually mean for us? Like, how will we experience these tariffs?
Yeah, well, okay, so there's two questions. There's how we experience the tariffs and what is the weird future that these people have envisioned for us, right? Start with the weird vision of the future. So a journalist asked Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, what is going to happen? Like a lot of what makes American life cost what it does is that Americans exploit people all over the world for very cheap labor to make things like clothes and stuff, and then buy them at Walmart, right? Are you expecting Americans to also work in textile factories for very little money in order to still purchase things at Walmart very cheaply? And he goes, well, no, of course not. That would be ridiculous. What I want to do is I want to make a country of engineers and HVAC technicians and computer scientists who will maintain all the machines that do our jobs. So let's think about that for a second, because there's like over 250 million eligible workers in the United States. Okay, just in the US. We've already seen in the automotive industry what happens when that kind of a process goes into place. We've seen this in the warehouse industry too, right? You end up with 100 workers instead of 3,000 in a car factory. You end up with workers who are overtired, kept to mechanized pacing, prevented from taking bathroom breaks because the machines don't take breaks in Amazon warehouses all over the country, right? That's the future they have envisioned for us, and that's not a future with enough jobs for everybody, right? In my other life, I hang out in hacker circles, and so I have a tendency to gravitate towards like analogies from cyberpunk, but it is hard to see what is happening as other than that. They're trying to privatize everything that's not a security function. They're trying to increase the ability of corporations to do their own security without consequences, right? They're trying to create an economy where we are stuck to working generally mechanized jobs all the time for companies which reap in ridiculous profits while a massive underclass continues to grow because there's not enough work. And the planet dies. Like, that's our future. That's the future that they view. That is the utopia that their ideology is trying to reach us to right now. Because one of the things about Trumpism is Trumpism has become a utopian movement. And what they are doing now is every bit as authoritarian and insidious as the use of state power to try and social engineer an entire society of people that has ever happened in any other circumstance. Because that's what this is. This is a massive act of social engineering being carried out by billionaires on our lives. That's what's happening right now.
Yeah, I just want to quote from an economic journal that just put out an article about that interview that you were talking about. In a recent interview, a senior Trump official acknowledged that the highly publicized tariff strategy aimed at reshoring U.S. manufacturing would not revive the traditional factory jobs many had hoped for. Instead, the future of U.S. manufacturing would be dominated by automation, leaving human workers sidelined. Again, like, this is just a worse version of what already exists, and they're talking about moving that here. I mean, like, the current arrangement is not good either. And I think that we should be clear when we critique what's happening that we are not defending the neoliberal order like a lot of liberals are.
I think this is a really important point, right? Like, one of the things that is happening, and you see it in Argentina with Milei, and I think that he's a really interesting model to look at increasingly because they increasingly are using the same rhetoric he uses, right? This has been developing over the course of maybe a month and a half. But all of his politics, right, are grounded in this kind of like doublespeak, right? That they're all talking about freeing workers and freeing people from the fetters of government and blah, 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 blah. But if you really look at what it is, it's extreme neoliberalism. Right? Like Milton Friedman, for those of you that really want to sort of like dig into the theory of neoliberalism, like you have to read Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman talks about neoliberalism as a structure in which the role of the state is to guarantee the smooth and continued and predictable functioning of the market economy. Okay, so their job is to stop strikes from happening, to stop protests from happening, to repress union organizing, to repress students, to do things like that, to generally privatize everything that the state has and sell it off for next to nothing so companies can make a profit on it, and reduce the state down to the point in which all they are doing is engaging in an increasingly all-expansive form of policing. That's the world here. That's the world that they envision. That is why the things that they are cutting are the things that they consider to be, quote, waste, like the Department of Education. So what we're watching here is not so much a shift in the underlying mentality of the American state. What we're watching here is we're watching the underlying mentality of the American state come out. We're watching the fetters get torn off. We're watching the limitations other politicians had imposed on themselves because they were worried about political support just fall away completely as if they never existed, right? Like, that's what's happening here. It's an expansion. It's an acceleration of the things that already make our lives miserable.
Right. I mean, again, from that same article I just quoted, says Lutnick, the person you were talking about, who himself is a billionaire, reassured CBS host that automation would be beneficial in the long term, suggesting that the U.S. would see an explosion of opportunities in mid-level trade professions such as mechanics and HVAC technicians to support the new automated facilities. Yeah. However, this would not bring back the kind of unionized working-class factory jobs that once were the backbone of American industry. It's automated factories, Lutnick acknowledged, admitting the shift towards robotics and industries like iPhone assembly would replace large swaths of the labor force. Again, I mean, this is more of the same. This is what we're seeing in the Rust Belt. This is what we're seeing in cities where everybody works at massive Amazon facilities. It's low-level service jobs, filling in the roles where people cannot be replaced in the supply chain by automation. Those are low-paid jobs. They're jobs where they're constantly trying to destroy unions and any sort of working-class self-activity. This is not a return to post-World War II 1950s. Everybody's moving on up into the middle class.
No, well, we have to remember that world not only was still based on segregation, but it was also incredibly heavily subsidized by the government. Right? Incredibly heavily subsidized by the government. Most of the growth of American infrastructure was. And so we're watching this kind of, and I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that what happened just now, if there's not an attempt to pull it back relatively quickly, will be paradigm shifting. That what ended, not in the good way, right? In the way that in which the world is now more oppressive and more capitalist, but what ended was the sort of era of globalization that started in the 1940s, in which trade barriers were coming down, in which there was an attempt to internationalize production and internationalize foreign policy and internationalize, relief operations and things like this. Like, that era is over now. Like that is what this is indicating. If there's not a pullback very, very quickly. So just to give you all an idea, we buy, how much of our electronics from China, right? Most. Before Trump got into office, there was a 34% tariff on electronics from China, and products that were under, I think it was $800, were able to be shipped into the United States without a tariff. This is how like Temu and AliExpress and Banggood and all these stores online work, is they ship low-cost items under the tariff limit, and that's how it gets into the United States. Okay? That's how our economy has worked for the better part of 20 years. And increasingly so for the better part of 20 years. Not just ours, but everyone else's too. Even if we're talking about something as simple as, like, let's take a circuit board on a car that is manufactured in America, right? Let's say the entire circuit board is manufactured in America. Those components aren't, right? Chances are the board isn't either. So now that board, which before could get shipped back and forth from China without a tariff, now is subject to initially a 34% tariff and now a 54% tariff. And then if China doesn't take the retaliatory tariffs away in 3 days from now, a 104% tariff. So my phone, right, which, let's say it was $500, is going to be like $1,000 now, more. That's the initial cost. That's just the initial cost. That doesn't take into account the fact that many of the things that are manufactured in the United States are, high technology things which are exported, right? A lot of our exports are high tech. A lot of our exports are services, right? Things that we won't be able to do because of retaliation now. We're going to be dealing with retaliatory tariffs that are going to drive our export costs up dramatically and cut those markets off for us, while the rest of the world happily sits there, signs trade deals, and isolates the United States. Because I think what the Trump administration and what a lot of Americans don't quite get is that the United States is very important to the way that the world functions, but that it could also just do that without the United States perfectly happily. And what we're watching now is we're watching the European Union negotiate trade deals with China directly. We're watching Brazil negotiate trade deals with Canada. Like, we're watching all of the dynamics of globalization that were terrible happen still, just without the United States involved, right? And we've been reduced down to this, like, whining child in the corner throwing a temper tantrum. And what that means, think about this from, again, long-term effects of the tariffs, right? This is Marx. This is out of Capital, for those of you that want to look, when Marx is talking about the projection of temporality in the construct of commodities, right? That when I make something in a capitalist economy, I am making it for the purpose of its sale, right? Like, I'm making it for the purpose of extracting exchange value from it. And what I am doing in that process is I am projecting a future in which that object will be sold. But not just which that object will be sold, but that money will be worth something, that the government will function, that police will stop my workers from striking, that I'll be able to go to the store in a week and use that money to buy something else. And that the store is going to accept that money because they also are going to assume that that money is going to be worth something 2 to 3 weeks from then, right? What just happened blows all of that up completely. You can't project anything anymore. Like, not only the Treasury Department has been going around telling companies like, hey, it's time to get rich now. There's no regulations in America. Just come to America and produce things. And all of these companies not only are not announcing new plants to open facilities in the US, they're pulling back on the ones that they had because they can't predict what the situation's going to be. Like, the entire underpinning of capitalist investment is undermined when something like this happens. Because the reality is like, Wall Street didn't believe him.
Right.
They didn't believe him. They were like, oh, it's a negotiating tactic. It's a negotiating tactic. The reality is this is so profoundly stupid from the level of economics, from the level of capitalist economics. This is so unthinkably dumb that no one thought that he would actually do it. And then he did. And now there's no answer as to how far is he going to go? What's he going to do? How far are these going to go? When are they going to go away? When are new ones going to get added? No one can tell anything anymore, good or bad or indifferent.
I just want to make one other point. I mean, I think we also cannot disconnect the push for automation here, under the guise of, Indian offshoring, sort of this like cloak of anti-globalization rhetoric, which is all just a smokescreen, from this push towards artificial intelligence as well. I think the two are very wedded to each other. And of course, as everybody knows, like, that's not something that is like making a bunch of, as the article I quoted stated, like a bunch of unionized blue collar jobs where just thousands of people are going to, have careers that they're going to retire on and put kids through college in or something, whatever the fantasy is. That's not what this is. No. And it's also about bringing all of these people and companies to heel under Trump and making them subservient to the regime, punishing different industries and capitalists that Trump sees as not on his team. So I think the next question, though, is that will this, because you're saying that this is a make or break moment essentially for the economy. We're deciding right now sort of what the contours of exploitation and work and capitalist economy looks like over the next period. So are we going to see a crash? Also, is that what they want? Like, do they want to have a 2008 style crash so they can kind of put the pieces back together? And is that what we're going to see? Because it seems to be headed in that direction.
If there's a crash, it's going to be much more fundamental than 2008. 2008 was a crash about a single market and the unpredictability of a single market in the wake of the job and wage crisis in the United States, right? That cascaded outwards into a bigger crisis. If this were to trigger a crisis, it would start as a massive crisis, not as a crisis of a company. But we'd be looking at more of a 1929 style. Everyone loses faith in the market and gets out. And the reality is we're already watching that happen. Investors are not economists, and that's important to keep in mind. But also sometimes they do interesting and relevant things. And one of the things that is incredibly relevant over the last month is that Warren Buffett has been quietly cashing out. Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest investors in America, who's been an investor since the mid-1960s through every economic crisis, is cashing out, is selling Berkshire Hathaway real estate, is selling all of his investments, is getting out. Not buying new ones, not buying bonds, just he's doing the billionaire version of take money, shove in mattress. Literally. I'm serious.
So what you're saying, people are looking at, or they will increasingly look at the stock market being like, the money that I have in my 401k or that I have in my account is going to disappear. So I better take it and put it into liquid cash, basically, and take that out of the system. Essentially a run on the bank, so to speak, like in 1929. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it's not that it's going to disappear. It's that you have no idea whether it will or not. Trump might wake up and eat something he didn't like for breakfast and be like, there's 70% more tariffs on China, and the entire market could crash. Right? You don't know. There's no way to do the basic calculations Marx talks about in the structure of commodities. You can't project what's going to happen in the future. And so in the service of this mission in which they are trying to reduce the state down to a market stabilization mechanism, they're throwing the whole thing into chaos. That's the astonishing part. That's the astonishing part. And and this has been said, we have said this, a number of Republican consultants have said this. They could have done all of these things more slowly and more deliberately, gotten roughly the same results with none of the chaos. Right? But they didn't do that.
So do you foresee a 1929 style crash then, or do you think that's still up in the air?
We have mechanisms to stop that happening in the same way. For example, we have the FDIC, so the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. All of you that have a bank account at a bank, not a credit union, but a bank. Credit unions have their own version of this. I forget what it's called. But if you have a bank account, up to $250,000, which I would imagine most of the people listening to the show don't have, up to $250,000, if your bank crashes, you still get your money back. Now, after $250,000, you don't necessarily get your money back. You might, if there's leftover money in the FDIC fund, get your money back, but you might not, right? And so what happened in 1929 is people went to the bank and banks didn't have money. They had lent out so much of the money that people had deposited in the banks that when people went back to get their money physically out, there physically was not money in the vaults. And that caused a run on the banks. People started rushing to the banks to pull their money out. That caused the banks to call all their debts in from people that borrowed money from them, which caused this cascade of bankruptcies, right? But a lot of that had to do with the fact that people were worried about losing all their money. And that would happen. There'd be runs on the bank because getting money out of FDIC is not easy, and getting all your money taken away by the bank definitely sucks. So it wouldn't be a not crisis, right? But it wouldn't have the same impacts. What would be impactful, though, is, again, in 1929, we were looking at a very different economy. Like the American economy today is 70% based on consumption and services, right? Many of the things that we consume come from overseas. Many of the things that we produce get sold overseas. So when Trump is talking about something like a trade deficit, what a trade deficit actually means is, so say the two of us are in business and you're in country A and I am in country B, and you buy $10 worth of tools from me and I sell them to you, and you make stuff that I then buy for $100. On paper, I now have a $90 trade deficit. Now, of course, I've turned around and sold that stuff and made money, right? So it's not an actual deficit. It's not a debt. Trump interprets it as a debt. So when he's saying, I need to take trade deficits down to nothing, what he literally means is everybody needs to buy as much stuff from us as we buy from them. And if that doesn't even out, then something's wrong. To do that is essentially taking a torch to the entire post-war economy. An economy that didn't exist in 1929. And that very much is the underpinning of like how we get pretty much everything today, not just in the US. That economy didn't exist in 1929. And so disrupting the entire global economy like this, on this level, this abruptly, with this level of unpredictability, has the ability of causing basic tensions within capitalism to really come to a head. Namely, the tension between this idea of producing a thing now to predict your outcome in the future, right? This notion that you somehow have to guarantee that intermediary period of time and the whole future after that in order to do investment, right? That can't happen right now. And if that can't happen right now, it just becomes a question of how long it takes for markets to start to degrade as investors pull their money out and literally shove it under mattresses or in their bunkers that they are building increasingly. Which, again, the billionaires are building bunkers. They didn't do that 25 years ago, right? These are all things we should be looking at with a lot of attention. You know, when someone like Warren Buffett liquidates billions of dollars of investments in a very short period of time, which is something he has never done before, you have to look at that and go, okay, whatever you think of him as a person, he is a person who's understood how stock markets work and generally has been right about them and is getting out completely, not putting money in gold, not putting it in trust fund that's going to get invested in, you know, sovereign debt funds or something. No, it's just literally taking it out and making it cash. Like the tax burden alone from that is massive.
Okay, so it sounds like you would more or less agree with some of the economic journals saying 50-50 chance, essentially.
Oh, I mean, the rates I've seen today are even higher.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, JP Morgan Chase was putting it up at 60. I've seen rates as high as 75, 80% chance. No one has come out with the full 100 yet because no economist will ever say that, but 80% is pretty high.
Because I was going to say,
that's very concerning.
What I remember from the 2008 crash is that, obviously a lot of people lost their jobs, but it was very much like the economy contracted and really slowed down, stagflation, I guess. I mean, so like if you were in construction, for instance, you probably got laid off because nobody wanted to build anything. There wasn't enough money. There wasn't capital to put into that. And then a lot of people lost their homes. So it was this cascade effect where it's like people are losing their jobs. People can't afford to make their mortgage payments. They are foreclosed on. A lot of corporations like bought up a lot of properties that got foreclosed on and then flipped them, turned them into rentals. This is what sort of produced the housing crisis that we all experience now, where everybody's paying up the butt for like all these, high rents because they're all owned by like a few hand of corporations. Again, but it sounds like something you're talking about might be a little more closer to like the image of the bread lines that we saw, in the financial crash of 2029. I mean, that sounds a little more intense.
So there was one number that I came across, which I found really interesting. I'm not going to remember the number exactly, but in the jobs report, which just came out, which showed that the U.S. economy had added 200,000 jobs, right? Which, of course, the administration held up as like this big thing. Somebody dug into the numbers and found out they'd only listed 5,000 federal employees as having lost their jobs that month. And everyone was like, but we know that's not right. It was 475,000. And what they did was they classified every single person still receiving a severance check as employed, which is not accurate. And so the jobs report was 400,000 jobs off just in government employees. That's bad. That's bad. That's really, really bad. I mean, we have to think about, again, I hate citing Marx because Marxists annoy me a lot of the time. Not all of you, some of you. But, one of the other things that Marx talks about in Capital is the fundamental importance of consumption for the continuation of capitalism and how this creates this kind of tension in the way that capital has to accumulate. So if you pay your workers nothing, then no one can buy anything, obviously, right? If you pay your workers a little bit, you make less profit. But overall, the economy can function. If you pay your workers more, you make even less profit. But overall, the economy can function, right? If all of a sudden you don't need any workers because you've automated their jobs away, well, that makes the number of people that can buy things shrink. I mean, this is not complicated math, right? Then that means that people down at the grocery store get fired. Then there's even less people to buy stuff. Then people down at the store everyone buys their clothes gets fired because there's even less people to buy stuff. And it cascades down and it cascades down and it cascades down. This is what we are facing. We're seeing the beginning points of that cascading happening already. It's already happening.
Like literally as we're talking about this, they're saying like the Social Security website is not working. It's having all these issues. I've personally heard from people that they're having problems getting their checks. The Republicans, they're pushing for massive tax cuts on the wealthy and corporations that will have to come with cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. So, I mean, it seems like a recipe for all the worst things that just benefit the top 1% of people, if we want to use that language.
Until the food riots start. I mean, like this is, this is one of the things about how they're doing this, right? If they were capable of doing the thing that they want to do, right? If they had the resources and the support to do the things that they want to do and make their like utopian world come into being, that's one thing, but that's also like impossible and weird and a massive act of social engineering and deeply, 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 deeply authoritarian and not what's happening. And so instead of them having this like MAGA utopia where everyone goes happily to work in the morning with their robots or whatever, what they've ended up with is this kind of like degraded post-capitalism in which we will not have any jobs here because they'll all be taken by robots, but we also won't be able to afford anything, right? That we're starting to hit a point in which, and this has already been true for some time in the United States, right? Since the 1970s, wages have been falling in relation to costs of living, like what's referred to in economics as real wages, have been falling since the 1970s, right? And that's still true. That is still happening. And so our cost of living keeps going up, but our wages in relation to that keep going down, but our cost of living keeps going up. That has to all come from somewhere, right? And that money comes from debt. But if people don't have jobs, they can't pay for things on credit cards. They can't pay back the debt they already have. Right? This is how something like firing 400,000 government employees becomes a banking crisis. You know, they're one of the things that is absolutely astonishing about this process so far is how little they understand or have thought through downstream effects. And so, you know, just as a simple example, like USAID has done all kinds of like not great stuff, right? But one of the roles of USAID in the United States is that it is a farm subsidy program. Like they buy all that wheat and corn from somewhere to send all over the world, right? And they've been buying surplus grain off American farmers since they were sending grain to the Soviet Union in the late 1920s, right? This has been like a long-standing U.S. government program that had been moved under USAID. So if you cancel USAID, now all of a sudden you've pushed down all the grain prices in the United States because there's a grain surplus. Well, one of the other things they did is they also shut down the office in the USDA that works with workers to get low interest loans to be able to afford equipment and seed and fertilizer for the growing season. So now all these farmers are going to have to take higher interest loans out to meet the contracts they have already signed, and they will be selling their crops for less money. That's how we got the farming crisis in the 1930s. That was like what the food exporting program was meant to help alleviate, was literally that exact situation. And all the ingredients are there to produce it again. They're just all right because they didn't think 3 levels down the chain, what is the downstream effect of this? And if I do this plus this, what is the downstream effect when those two things converge?
Yeah, well, it seems like they've convinced themselves that, like, to do that would be, like, to be woke or something, or, you know, that's what the deep state wants. I mean, it seems like these people are so blind to their ideology, they don't really understand how stuff works. And I think that that's sort of the reality that's been exposed by this, is that, yes, it's true that Trump has surrounded himself with sycophants that, like, are yes people to his larger project, but what that also means is that there's just not a lot of adults in the room that like understand how the sausage actually gets made, and they're just sort of, you know, running around. You know, it's a very Maggian project, if I can use that term with a straight face. Like, it is about manufacturing consent of the people that are on the team, and everybody else, if they cry about it, then that's even better. And it's just about sort of like going out into the world and being like, hell yeah, Trump is doing that, and he's a smart guy, and, you know, it's all going to work out. And like, if you think this is bad, then you're just a cuck and a woke and whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're essentially saying that. They're like, oh yeah, you know, things are going to get hard for a while, you know, and what I resent about that, you know, maybe this is my like working class Rust Belt self coming out, but like the thing I resent about that so much isn't the fact that it's going to make us broke. That sucks bad enough. It's the fact that there are people that think that they have that kind of power over my life. Like, that's the thing that just really gets the hair standing up on my back. That just really makes me furious. Like, these people live 7 hours away from where I am. And they're sitting here thinking that they can play around with their little ideological project while my life is the material that they're playing around with. Yeah, no, thank you. No, I didn't sign up for their utopian project.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not particularly thrilled that they're trying to make us all participate in it. Like, that is something we all have to really talk about. Because one of the things that's happening here is it's not authoritarianism in the traditional sense, in the way that people came to understand it in the 30s, but that doesn't make it any less authoritarian, and that doesn't make it any less an act of mass social engineering. And that is deeply important for us to understand. Like, we have to understand that that's what's going on. They're trying to create a new kind of country, a new kind of person, a new kind of American, right? Like, that is deeply disturbing stuff. And they're using state force to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, this could be its whole other conversation, but like, you know, a lot of us saw that weird Milo tweet that was like, yeah, white American men are going to love working in an iPhone factory because it's so manly and all this stuff. And, you know, as we're saying, like, that is not even what they're proposing. They're saying, like, no, the jobs that are going to be created are these like mid-level technicians that manage automation, which, as we've talked about, is not going to be that many jobs. But this sort of MAGA bedtime story that like by bringing manufacturing back that's going to make people more manly, or we're going to socialize people in this way. It reminds me of the Hitler quote, like, we can socialize factories, why can't we socialize human beings? Which again, like, I don't see how, I mean, none of this stuff seems to be very popular, and there's already a lot of viral clips of a lot of MAGA influencers that have lost a lot of money that are going viral right now. I don't see how people's 401ks getting destroyed and small business owners and farmers, I mean, going under is going to be popular. These are people that are a large part of the MAGA base. I understand that this is part of a wider project. I just don't see how these people, especially how disorganized and stupid they are going to come out of this as a net gain, especially as it seems like it would take years for a lot of this stuff to really sort of come to fruition. And like you said, if they
it
were,
happened at all.
if it happens at all, like you said, it seems to be much more intelligent if they would have done this in a long-term project, which, I mean, again, as we've, in our interview with Jamie Merchant, like Biden and the Democrats were already on board for targeted tariffs. Like they continued that. They were pushing to like build factories for semiconductors in certain spaces. So, I mean, like this project has already been sort of taken up and pushed. I just think they are just rushing to hit the button, which again, I think begs the question, like, is this collapse somehow part of a grand design? I don't really like to get into the idea that they're playing 4D chess. I don't think it's that complicated for them. I just think they think, like we've said before, that they're on a very short timeline and they've just got to go.
And they increasingly believe their own rhetoric. So a person to watch right now is a person that generally say don't pay any attention to because he's an idiot, but he's actually really influential right now, is Peter Navarro. So Peter Navarro and Elon Musk have been getting into it on social media because Musk doesn't like the tariffs because, most of even though Teslas get assembled in the US, most of those components are not made in the US, right? They are made somewhere else and they are shipped here and they're put together into car form in a car plant somewhere in the United States, right? So Musk is very against tariffs. He's been like posting, videos of Milton Friedman talking. And Peter Navarro has been like going back at him on Twitter or something like that. But the thing is Peter Navarro does believe this. He legitimately believes that if they do this way, that magically manufacturing will just show up on American shores again within, as he said, 1 year. You can't even make the factory equipment to do that in a year. You definitely can't retrain an entire workforce in the middle of an economic crisis in a year.
Yeah, this is some like Mao backyard steel.
No, it is. There is a deeply Stalinist kind of 5-year plan element to this, in which they have decided that there's going to be a specific outcome, and they are just going to bludgeon us until it happens.
Navarro's the guy they found on Amazon, right? That just wrote a dumb book, and
that's
like,
the guy
he's
that
the
Jared
guy
Kushner found on Amazon, who was advocating like 80% tariffs on China and an actual, not trade, but actual real shooting war with China because they, quote, stole our jobs.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, the fact that him and Musk are getting into it begs the last question I want to talk about before we switch to talking about the recent protests is, what does this mean for this sort of rift that's developed within ruling circles, elites, and billionaires? Yeah, you have Musk coming out. He actually gave a talk to some like far-right quasi-fascist party in Italy, and he was saying, what we need a free trade zone between the US and Europe. You have different billionaires coming out, even ones that have supported Trump, being like, this is not the way forward, this is bad. It seems like some of the tech people are starting to have cold feet about this. Like you said, I think a lot of people in elite circles, various capitalists, are thinking like, oh, this was just a negotiation strategy. And then they're finding out like, oh, he's actually really, really serious.
He's really serious.
So what does that mean? Because in theory also too, like we saw Ted Cruz has come out and saying like, look, this is bad. The Democrats are going to slaughter us in the midterms. if this gets really bad, like people are going to turn against the Republican Party. You know, in theory, they could, and there's already been some movement on this. The Republicans could say, like, we're going to block the tariffs through the Congress if they wanted to. So, I mean, it seems like there is a risk that there might be some rebellion within the Republican Party if this gets really bad. I think right now they're going to kind of see how bad it gets because they're kind of unwilling to hold Trump to account. But what does it mean that these cracks are starting to form?
I mean, we said it on our previous iteration of the show in November, right? Late November. There is a part of Trump's agenda which is not good for business that is international, right? That's just inherently true, especially if you're someone like Bill Ackman, the Zionist billionaire investor who like makes his money on stock investments. You know, not being able to trade internationally is really bad for a person like that. And at some point, there was going to be a moment in which we were going to see who was really dedicated to this project, that the contours of the project were going to become clear, that at some point an ideological faction was going to win out, and everybody else that was holding on with the attempts, with the hope that they could get their way through a Trump administration, is going to have to figure out what to do. And that's the moment we're at. Trump hasn't talked about AI in months. Right? Howard Lutnick talks about it, but Trump hasn't talked about AI and his big new data center in a very long time. He's not interested anymore. You know, like Musk is old news. He's a burden. He's a weight now. You know, like Trump used all of those Silicon Valley people. Like he played them super hard. They all thought that they were so smart. And Andreessen Horowitz even released an entire like techno-utopian futurist manifesto like last fall, which I just heard about and I read recently about how they were going to create this like new world of like AI automated factories and stuff, and that the Trump administration was going to be their vehicle to do that. Right? The problem always has been, and we've been saying this from the beginning, is that the Trump administration is many political projects with one common goal. And the common goal is this consolidation of state power. Outside of that, why they are doing it, what they want to do with it, what they hope their goals are going to be, and therefore what it means to even consolidate state power, all of that, there are massive disagreements about within this administration. Something like Stephen Miller's immigration policies are absolutely horrible for international business. Like horrible. I mean, it's just the agricultural economy alone in the United States is freaking out because of that. And so you have this moment in which capitalism and capitalists that made their money in the globalized economy ended up becoming the people that funded a campaign whose goal it was to end the globalized economy. And then they went, wait a minute, you were serious about that? I thought I was going to be able to talk you into like building me a new AI data center or something like that. I didn't think you were actually going to crash the entire globalization order. And that's what he did. And again, not in the good way, not in the like, yay, we're all a lot more free because we don't have to engage in like wage labor anymore and capitalism is gone. Like, no, it's in the like cyberpunk dystopia kind of way, right? But that's what we're looking at. And so all these people like Mark Andreessen, people like this who had a certain vision, that's not the vision that's happening now. And I think you're going to watch those people drop out. You're going to watch those people drop back because they weren't committed to the MAGA project in the way that Trump understands what that is. They were trying to squeeze their project into that container in order to be able to capitalize on the people and the energy and the resources that exist within that world. Because people in Silicon Valley, most Americans don't like them. Most people don't even know who Mark Andreessen is. He's like not only one of the wealthiest investors in the world, he also helped write the first browser. Right? Most people don't even know who this guy is. Right? They don't have the ability to take power on their own. What they need is existing political movements that they can sort of latch themselves onto and try and ride into power. And they tried to do that this time, and they got almost all the way there. They got right up to the apex. And then Trump did a bunch of stuff that they don't like, that's contrary to their vision.
So do you see Musk and Trump breaking over this?
I could see not necessarily a public break. I could definitely see Musk drifting back into the background more, using his I have to go back to my businesses as an excuse, and sort of drifting back out of the public eye a little bit. I could definitely see him doing that. I think where you're really going to see this fight play out is you're going to see this fight play out between Congress and the executive branch. There are enough Republican House members that are unhappy about this to get a bill through the House. And so if Congress asserts its ability to govern tariffs again, now we're going to be in for a legal fight that will define a political era.
Because I also think it's very realistic that there's a lot of people that, if they are opposed to this, they want Trump to own it. Like, they don't want to come out and be like, oh, Trump bad. They want things to get so bad they can kind of come in and be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But will it be too late at that point? I mean, I think there is, in terms of the electoral aspect to this, I think there is an argument to be made that they'll have to own it as well. They're allowing all this to happen. They're going to be wedded to whatever disaster happens. So should they move now? I don't know. I think we're kind of asking ourselves questions that, we don't know the answers to. But
yeah, well, and, to kind of pivot a bit into the next discussion about the protests, like, what I'm seeing around where I'm at, which is a deeply, deeply, deeply Democratic area, is the Democratic Party really woke up in like the last 2 weeks. Like, the rally on the 5th was huge. That was mostly Democratic Party aligned organizations. The unions have gotten really loud all of a sudden. We're starting to see billboards all over the place. We're starting to see people registering voters again. They're kind of ramping into campaign mode, even though we're a solid year and almost a year and a half out from the actual midterms. They're ramping into campaign mode already. And what their messaging is the thing that Trump says about workers getting screwed over is right. But look at what he's doing. He's hanging out with these billionaires and firing everyone and like crashing the economy. And you're the ones that are going to pay for this billionaire's attempt to restructure your life. And there's this like deep sense of Rust Belt resentment that's kind of like wrapped into that whole way of talking about it. But there is this deep resentment of the social engineering components of this, almost regardless of the outcomes. Just a deep resentment. Now, of course, what the Democrats don't talk about is they themselves are a party of social engineering, right? Like, they themselves have tried to use the mechanisms of the state to rebuild society. Like, the Republicans are not alone in this. It's just Trump is doing it very overtly and in very sort of abrupt ways. And the people that he's surrounded himself to do it with come from a very specific class composition. And that's really noticeable. And so what I'm seeing a lot is I'm starting to see a Democratic Party that is positioning itself to be able to benefit from the discontent that gets generated by what Trump is doing. And what they did on April 5th was the beginning of their attempt to sort of be like, to get out ahead of the protest movements and go, okay, cool, we're going to get out ahead of this, and then we're going to steer it right back into the electoral system. So everyone go focus on the midterms, right? And that was the tone of a lot of those rallies. It was very electoral. It was very based in getting out the vote and knocking on doors was like one of the things that was said at the rally around here a lot. And like, there were elected officials at it and stuff like this. It was an acceptable opposition. It was an acceptable opposition. Because what the Democrats, I think, have realized is that all the way back to the anti-war movement, they've been behind us. That we're always out there first. We're always on the front. And then they have to like scurry behind us and try and like, get rid of the radicals on the street and come to a compromise and try and gain legitimacy that way and try and like suck up all the moderates in the process, right? Like, this is their MO. They've been doing this ever since the labor movement, right? This is how the Democratic Party works. Instead of doing that this time, it looks like they're trying to get out ahead of it. They're trying to essentially create dynamics that I don't want to say are like the Tea Party, but aren't entirely dissimilar, in the sense that there are a small number of large organizations that are involved in coordinating many local actions, and then treating that as the resistance, not one element of what's going on, not as one approach to what's happening, but as the resistance, right? because during the first Trump years, the Democratic Party really lagged behind us. And all the way up through 2020, they were fighting us about stuff. And what they saw happen was they saw themselves lose a lot of legitimacy with younger people in the process of doing that. And so what I think they're trying to do now is they're trying to get out ahead of protests. They're trying to say, look, we're here, we're doing this, and we're going to be the ones that organize the protests. If you want to come to the protest, you got to come to ours. By the way, here's our nonviolence guideline, right? Like, that was the tone I picked up. But that tone is different than the tone that they had like 4 weeks ago. And so I'm noticing this kind of shift in the way that they're starting to approach things. But the demonstrations on April 5th, I think we have to be somewhat careful of. I mean, it's great that there were a lot of people out there. Like, don't get me wrong. You know, my mom was there. A bunch of people I knew were there. Like, don't get me wrong. It was great. A bunch of people were there. But we have to be incredibly careful and intentional to make sure that that is not understood as what resistance is. Like, that was a chance to hang out in a park with a bunch of people that think the same thing you do. That's not what a resistance movement looks like. And so if we're going to participate in those kinds of things, that's great. But we have to recognize that that is always going to be fundamentally insufficient for the moment that we are facing. And the moment that we're facing is one of material conflict with the state. Not like just in the way that we tend to understand that at protests, but in the sense that we are now in a conflict with the state. We don't get a choice about things like operational security and, you know, direct action. Like, these are how we have to operate because the state is trying to wage a declared conflict against us, right? Like, we are in an era of repression. That is important to understand, as well as the stakes of what's going on. So, like, while April 5th might not meet that, I think what it does show is, like, there is this attempt by the Democratic Party to get out ahead of it. And we have to be both attentive to that and also incredibly cautious of that at the same time, you know, while that's happening.
Yeah, I think people should be aware that, like, the group Indivisible, which is sort of like a progressive, Democratic-aligned group, I think it's Grassroots. I'm sure it has lots of funding. It's Grassroots in the sense that, like, most of the organizers are just people that sign up, and I know they've had a huge influx of people joining the group and setting up chapters since Trump came into power. They were monumental in, like, flipping the House blue in 2018. I'm sure that's the plan to do it now. Yeah, I agree that it really does have a progressive Tea Party feel to it. I think that, like the Tesla protest, its limitations are sort of made up in the makeup of the people that are out there. And I feel like one of those key limitations is there's almost a certain sort of conservative nature to it, in that a lot of this is hearkening back to, like, we want to return sort of to the Biden era, you know, hands off, Social Security. We basically just want to go back to the way things were, which I think is really a mistake, and we should be critical of that. You know, we want to push back, and I'm not saying, of course, we want to, like, cheerlead Social Security being ravaged or privatized or anything. Of course, we want to, like, defend what exists in terms of protections for poor and working people, but we should be clear that we want to get rid of the old neoliberal order as well and want something totally different, even if we understand that Trump is not, you know, an alternative. But yeah, I think there's a question of, like, how much we can engage or, you know, build at these demonstrations. I think they're like everything. I think they're sort of a litmus test for where we're at, which is that a lot of, you know, the sort of demographics that are coming out to these demonstrations, largely white, largely sort of progressive, Democratic aligned folks that are angry about the Doge cuts, that are personally impacted. I mean, obviously they're very animated by this. I think this is sort of a different sort of feel than the people that were coming out to say, like, the George Floyd protests or even the Palestine stuff, which were more downwardly mobile young people, Zoomers and millennials, that were upset about, you know, structural things happening and pushing back against that. And I think, but I mean, I do think, like, these things are good, obviously. Like, they show that there's mass disaffection with things that are going on. I mean, it's harder now for the media and other people to be like, you know, where are the protests? Like, they're literally happening all over. I mean, every time you look around, there's an ICE protest, there's a Tesla protest, there's a hands-off protest, there's unions are protesting now. Unions are actually really stepping up and demanding that these people that have been disappeared, many of them are union members. The guy that was sent to El Salvador over administrative error, according to the Trump administration, he was a member of a union. His union's coming out against that. So, I mean, more and more people are standing up. There's demonstrations happening all over. I think it's a question of us finding a way to interact with people and share skills that people have, and also just involve them in organizing so things don't turn into just people turning out for these big events. And I think that's like kind of what we're seeing with the Bernie rallies, is that they're set up in the sense that they sort of have this feel of a social movement, like something is happening, there's thousands of people. But then, of course, the question is, what do we do with that? Is it actually going to be something that challenges the state's power and actually leverages the power of all these people, like through strikes, through blockades, through mass protests? Or is it just going to be like, we're just going to basically hype people up and then get them ready to vote? And I think the thing that we need to remind ourselves is, like you said, they're really getting in front of this thing, is that we actually have the power to steer where things are going. I mean, people are organizing this. People are taking action. And I think this is a time when people can experiment and do things and meet the moment where they're at. Like, and especially if, like you said, the economy gets worse. I mean, I think that we'll see another wave of mutual aid projects take off, just like we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, the start of it. I think that it's very possible that, anarchists and other autonomous activists could have a key role in doing that. I can totally see that spreading across the social terrain. Yeah, I mean, it's a wild time. I think, what's so crazy about this moment is that, if we understand the Trump administration to be this authoritarian project, which obviously it is, its authoritarian nature derives not from groups of Proud Boys going across and, neighborhood to neighborhood, or even military tanks on the streets, but it's just from the weaponization of the bureaucracy and politicizing them, but also just in this, what I've been calling bureaucratic refusal. It's like, oh, we sent this guy to El Salvador because the government paid us millions of dollars and now he's just there and we're just refusing to go get him. So it's the barbarism is within just the sheer inertia and bureaucracy of these institutions themselves and just their decisions that they're making, which is very terrifying in a lot of ways, because I mean, this is a massive bureaucratic fucked up system,
Yeah. Well, and what that means is that it plays out in microaggressions, and that's really important for us to recognize that. What are we watching with students getting detained and deported? It's not that they're showing up at a group meeting and rounding up 20 people and putting them in vans and driving them off to the airport. It's that they're kidnapping individual students off the street, right? They're losing the paperwork. Like, there was a soldier who, for the veteran of the Iraq War, is also in the prison in El Salvador because he had applied for citizenship after getting out of the army in 2006, and they gave him temporary status and then lost his paperwork. And then he got arrested and put in prison because he had a PTSD attack and shot up a porch full of people. So his paperwork was just lost in the system. He got out of prison 2 months ago, got detained when he got out, and deported. That's a random microaggression. That could have been any number of hundreds of people that are in a similar situation that could have happened to. And it didn't happen to any of the rest of them, just one. That's what makes it so arbitrary and unpredictable. And that's what makes it so effective, is it creates this sort of ambient fear and anxiety and waiting. But we can't do that. I've been doing these things for long enough that I know that when we fall into that mindset in which we can't trust anything, then we end up destroying ourselves, right? We turn on each other. In reality, what we have to do is we have to make our political relationships in these moments not superficial, right? It's not about, I share this opinion with someone, right? We have to find the people that we want to be around, and we have to hold those people tight. This is a moment where we really have to have each other's back. Not just people in our club or on the cool kid team or whatever, but the dude who lives up the street from your social center, the kids who, have broken down shoes, who run past every day after school, the people who like can't get enough food to eat. Like, these are the people that we have to hold close. There's nothing else. All of the survival mechanisms to make capitalism palatable, gone, right? Like, they're disappearing. Where I'm at, food that was going to go to the food bank that would have fed like 500,000 people over the course of the next month just didn't show up because some bureaucrat in DC canceled a grant, right? This is in the Rust Belt. Like, a lot of those people just won't eat. Those kinds of microaggressions, those kinds of harms, right? They're invisible, right? They're invisible.
And again, with the food bank example you raise, I think this again is a real opportunity. I mean, I hate to, frame it as such because it's terrible, but I mean, it is an opportunity for us to step up and not only organize around that and do something about it, which people like us have, muscle memory, so to speak, of doing things like that, but also call out, the old saying, only anarchists can say what anarchists can say, to call out the crisis of the state and capitalism, and that this is not an alternative to, the decades of neoliberalism and unfettered capitalism that people have been experiencing. And I think, again, and I think this has kind of been on a slow boil, but I think one of the things that I'm hopeful about the sort of hands-off Tesla stuff is it's people coming together and doing things together. And I think one of the things that we should be cautious about, especially like the Democrats kind of coming in and trying to kind of put their hands on everything, is that they will push people away from doing that and they will herd them into the elections. And I think that it's important that we remember the best things about moments like this is they get people to come together, organize, like even these like town halls and unions doing stuff are an opportunity for people to build those relationships. And we've really got to push in that direction to do that. And I think that a lot of people right now are just so overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. They're not experimenting enough and trying to bring people together. Not only just people like ourselves, but just our neighbors and people in the area. Because a lot of people are freaking out right now. I mean, if the protests show anything, it's that a large section of the population is upset, scared. And that's just, I mean, who knows by the time that you hear this, what the economic situation will be like, but it doesn't look great. So I think I encourage people listening to this to like hold events, hold assemblies, start a mutual aid project, like do something. Try, get out there, do it. Now is the time to really experiment and do stuff.
Well, and start to think about what the needs in your area are and how they're not getting fulfilled, right? I mean, where I'm at, those needs are everywhere. But one of the things that a lot of friends of mine from out of town will notice when they walk in is there's like free everything when you walk in. There's free COVID tests, there's free masks, there's free condoms, there's free gloves, there's free hand sanitizers, free histamines, there's free this, there's free, there's free everything because there's a lot of need. And these are all things that we've heard that people need and we've found out ways to get in enough quantity to give out. And so, really the thing I just want to encourage everyone to do more than anything, in moments like this, there's this tendency for us to abstract our resistance heavily, to think about it as us fighting against this abstract state about these abstract issues, right? But I think this moment needs to remind all of us that at the end of all of that, there's real people who are really suffering, who live in the neighborhood where we run our social centers, who live in the neighborhoods where we have our collective houses, who live in the places where we make our lives. We need to become a part of these places because these spaces now have become the terrain of the conflict. I would argue that they always are. But it's become incredibly obvious that it is now the microaggression. The 5 ICE agents that storm into the taqueria up the street and cart away half the kitchen staff and try and deport them. The kids that are getting cut off from childcare. The doctors at the research hospital that don't have jobs anymore because all their grants got canceled. Right? Those kinds of things. We need to know when those things are happening in our spaces. We need to know when those things are happening in the areas of our homes that we operate in, right? And we need to be able to respond to those things. What that means is that we have to not respond to every outrage, not respond to everything by immediately just knee-jerk organizing a protest or going to one or something like that. That's great. But if there's something that we can do that has longevity, that gives us capacity, that gives us resiliency, that gives us the ability to stand up to the repression that is going to come, or the world that is already collapsing, those are the things that we should be putting our energy. Those are the things that allow us to make the actions that are taken outside of those spaces impact us less and less, right? Because we're not at a moment where asking them to stop or asking them to change direction matters. They're not going to. Us getting together at protests is about people meeting each other and building networks and getting energy together. But it's not going to convince them to change direction, right? What will is an inability to operate and impose their agenda, which won't get them to change direction, but it will also make that direction matter less, and open actual resistance. And so, yeah, people should go to these things. You know, you should go, you should talk to people, hand out zines, just like be a human at a protest, you know, and just like talk to whoever's next to you. But really go there with an eye towards getting a sense of where the kind of like mainstreamed resistance is, right? That the sort of like astroturfed, vaguely astroturfed kind of, you know, party aligned resistance is going to be. Because wherever that direction is, we need to be looking at that very critically and finding spaces adjacent to it, right? Not that we eschew it directly, but that we ourselves move in different spaces, right? Anarchists in the United States are incredibly good at logistics and local organizing and mutual aid and things like this, right? And this is a time for us to really embrace the idea that the fight sometimes also looks like a potluck, and it sometimes looks like rioting, and it sometimes looks like things on fire, and it sometimes looks like garden planting. And all of that is about creating the space for new ways to live and then figuring out new ways to live, right? That's the point that we're at. We're at the point in which we just have to do that. It's not a question of asking anymore or even fighting for the space. It's a question of asserting that our space is there by driving the state out and then creating new ways to live. But we need communities resilient enough and strong enough with enough capacity to be able to do that. And that doesn't happen just overnight. And that doesn't happen because there's a lot of numbers of people in the street. That happens because of trust. That happens because of real relationships. That happens because of people having a stake in each other's lives, looking out for one another, making sure that everyone comes back, right? That you leave nobody behind, right? These are the things that have kept the anarchist community in the United States strong through round after round after round after round after round of repression. Not just strong, but growing. Like, we know how to do this. We know how to do this. Done it before. We need to recognize that we have this basis, that we're not lost. But what we have to do is we have to move in ways that are unlike ways that we have moved before. And we have to move in ways that are unlike the ways that the big organizations are trying to push everybody in, right? And a lot of that is going to involve us establishing what home is for us, wherever we want to post up, and recognizing that that's the place that we operate in and getting to know it as well as we humanly can, right? That is how we are going to have an advantage in this fight. And it is going to be a struggle coming forward, not just because the state is going to get repressive, but the condition in which we are going to be fighting in is going to be one that is degrading. And that's going to be incredibly difficult to do. So we need to have the communities that can hold us up while we're doing that. That can support people when they lose their jobs, that can make sure that people have housing, right? We need to do that, because if we can't feed ourselves and we can't house ourselves, we can't have the energy to fight, right? Like, that is our task. Our task is to build a resistance movement, not a protest one. And sometimes that looks like going to protests, but oftentimes it looks like doing a lot of other things, with going to protests being a relatively small part of what we're doing.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea. News and analysis from the front lines of anarchist and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.